Have you ever loved someone so deeply that you were willing to sacrifice your dignity to keep the relationship alive? What if that very love began to break you down instead of building you up? In today's story, we're going to dive into a powerful lesson about self-worth, love, and the price we pay for a connection that isn't built on respect. Stick around until the end because this isn't just a tale of love gone wrong. It's a wake-up call for anyone who has ever felt diminished, disrespected, or unseen in a relationship. Whether you're young or old, this story will challenge you to reflect on the way you value yourself and the kind of love you deserve. It's time to stop sacrificing your happiness for someone else's approval. And in this video, we'll show you how. By the end of this story, you'll walk away with a powerful message about reclaiming your dignity, no matter how old you are, and why it's never too late to love yourself enough to walk away from toxic situations. This is a must-watch for anyone who's ever felt the sting of unappreciated love or struggled to find the strength to leave a relationship that was no longer healthy. Don't miss out. Let's explore this journey together. If you are not subscribed, I recommend subscribing and activating the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Your support means a lot to me, and if you enjoyed this video, you can help me continue spreading the valuable lessons by liking and sharing it. If you like the topic of this video, please comment 1. If you don't, please comment 0 to let me know how I can improve and make better videos for you. Now, let's begin. From the very beginning, he knew this relationship was not going to be easy. Everyone around him, friends, family, acquaintances, seemed to raise their eyebrows, exchanging knowing looks and whispering doubts behind his back. They all questioned his judgment, unsure how this could end well. His closest friends, who had witnessed the trials and triumphs of his life, had no problem expressing their skepticism. "You're too old for this," one of them had said, half in jest but also with a serious undertone, as if they were trying to shield him from something he couldn't possibly understand. But it wasn't just his friends who were worried. His children, those who loved him the most, were far more direct in voicing their concerns. His son, always the practical one, had said plainly, "Dad, are you sure about this? You've got nothing to prove anymore." His daughter, her voice quivering with genuine worry, had warned him, "This isn't the right time for something like this, not at your age." Their words, though spoken out of love, stung, but they were also a reflection of their deep concern for his well-being. They couldn't bear the thought of him getting hurt, emotionally or otherwise. In those quiet moments when he was alone, sitting in the stillness of his home, he couldn't help but ask himself the same question. Is this wise? Was he being foolish, chasing after something that was no longer meant for him? And yet, in the deepest part of his heart, in the quiet recesses of his mind, there was a spark of defiance, a quiet voice that told him not to listen to the naysayers. At 70, when the world seemed to tell him his best days were behind him, he still had the fire of youth smoldering within him. It wasn't that he wanted to pretend he was 20 again. He knew that wasn't possible, but there was something about the idea of love, true love, that still called to him with the same urgency it had when he was younger. He longed to experience the passion and excitement of a fresh connection, a bond that could make his heart race with the same thrill he had once known. The idea of love, not just as companionship but as an adventure, seemed to promise something more. Something deeper. He had spent most of his life living within the boundaries set by others. By society, by family, by age. And now, with the years behind him and the unknown future ahead, he was ready to break free. He wanted to feel alive again, to experience that rush of joy, that sense of possibility that had once seemed limitless. He needed to know that it wasn't too late to find love, not just for the companionship it offered, but for the sense of purpose it could bring. It was a longing, a yearning, that consumed him. He wanted to prove that time hadn't stolen everything from him, that he still had something to give, and that it wasn't too late for a new beginning. What started as a cautious step, a tentative exploration into something unfamiliar, soon spiraled into something far deeper, something he hadn't expected. What began as a simple desire for connection, a wish to rekindle some of the magic he once knew, became an all-consuming pursuit. He found himself thinking about her constantly. Her smile, her laugh, the way her eyes lit up when she looked at him. He had poured everything into this relationship, giving more of himself than he ever thought possible. He had always prided himself on being rational and measured, but with her, it was different. She had somehow unlocked a part of him that had been dormant for years, a part that was desperate for affection, for intimacy, for the kind of connection that made him feel whole again. He treated this relationship as though it were his last great love, the one to define the rest of his life. He didn't know how much longer he had to live, and in some ways, that made every moment with her feel more precious, more urgent. This was his chance to experience something pure, something untainted by the scars of the past. He poured his heart, his soul, into it, giving everything he had, often without thinking about the consequences. But in doing so, he hadn't considered the price, the toll it would take on him emotionally, mentally, and eventually, physically. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 1 below to let me know that you are still here with me. In those early days, everything seemed like a dream come true. She was a breath of fresh air in his life, a whirlwind of energy and warmth that revived him in ways he hadn't felt in years. Every conversation with her was like a little spark of joy. Every touch was electric. She made him feel young again, in ways that seemed impossible for someone his age. Her words were like music to his ears. Every compliment she gave him was like a balm to his weary soul. She didn't just see the old man who had lived a long life. She saw the man he used to be, the man he still believed he could be. She saw his worth, his value, in ways that no one else had for a long time. And in her eyes, he felt powerful, invincible, even. It was as though the years had melted away, and in their place stood a man who could still make his dreams come true. Every time she looked at him, he felt seen, valued, and alive in a way that made him forget the aches in his body and the gray in his hair. She awakened something inside him, a vitality he thought had long been buried under the weight of time. He had forgotten what it felt like to be truly desired, to be wanted in such an intimate, passionate way. Her gaze made him feel as if he could conquer anything, even time itself. She made him feel like he was enough, just as he was, even though the world had often told him otherwise. He responded with a fervor that surprised even him. He treated her with a tenderness and care he had reserved for those few precious people in his life who had meant the world to him. He gave her everything, his time, his affection, his devotion. He lavished her with gifts, showered her with praise, and made her feel like the most important person in the world. He saw in her a miracle, a gift that had entered his life when he thought the universe had no more surprises left for him. She wasn't just a woman to him. She was a symbol of hope, of second chances, of all the things he had longed for but never dared to ask for. He treated her like royalty, cherishing every moment with her, almost as though he were afraid it would slip away too soon. But even amidst this bliss, amidst the joy and the excitement, there were small, almost imperceptible warning signs. Little moments, small cracks in the perfect facade, that he chose to overlook. There were times when he saw something in her eyes, something that made him pause, that made him wonder if this was truly as perfect as it seemed. And yet, he couldn't stop. His heart had already been swept away, and he was unwilling to face the truth of what was happening until it was too late. At first, her demands were almost imperceptible, little requests veiled in the same sweet charm that had initially captivated him. They were the kind of gentle suggestions that you'd barely notice unless you were paying close attention. A subtle tilt of her head, a soft smile, and a few words here and there. "Wouldn't it be nice if we tried this?" Or, "I think you'd look great if you did that," all wrapped up in an air of playful innocence. It was so easy to overlook the fact that these were not just innocent musings. They were quiet instructions, crafted with the sort of skill that only someone with a clear understanding of how to manipulate affection could possess. And in those early days, he didn't mind. He welcomed them. Everything she asked for seemed so simple, so harmless. He was eager to please her, to show her how deeply he cared, how much he was willing to adapt to make her happy. The joy of being in love made everything feel light, almost effortless. He felt honored to be the one she turned to for approval, for validation. Her smile, her laughter, it made him feel alive in ways he never thought possible. There was a deep sense of satisfaction in accommodating her, in shifting small parts of himself to better fit into the space she carved out for him. Every time he agreed to a small change, it felt like he was drawing closer to her heart, like he was becoming the perfect partner she had always dreamed of. It was intoxicating, the idea that he could be the one to make her feel fulfilled, that he could play a role in her happiness. He told himself, "This is love. This is what love is all about. It's about giving, about adjusting, about compromise." But as time went on, something started to shift. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, her requests grew more pointed, more demanding. The suggestions, once gentle and wrapped in sweetness, began to take on a sharper edge. They were no longer just requests. They were expectations, and her tone, which had once been light and playful, began to carry an undercurrent of frustration. She would casually mention, "It would be so much better if you did things my way," as if it were the most natural thing in the world. What had started as innocent preferences gradually turned into a laundry list of demands that she expected him to meet, without question. At first, he misread it all. He told himself it was just confidence, that she was simply asserting herself, and he admired that about her. There was something undeniably alluring about her assertiveness, about the way she carried herself with such an unwavering sense of self-assurance. He thought it was a mark of strength, something that made her even more attractive. He convinced himself that it was a healthy dynamic, a kind of playful push and pull that came with the territory of any strong relationship. Yet, he didn't realize how much of himself he was starting to lose in the process. With every adjustment, every concession to her will, he found himself bending further and further from the man he had been before. His old habits, his preferences, began to feel irrelevant and unnecessary in comparison to what she wanted. It wasn't that he disliked the changes, not at first. He believed naively that each step he took toward meeting her needs brought him closer to her, that it was the ultimate sign of love. He was willing to lose himself, piece by piece, if it meant securing her affection. But then, as months turned into years, the thrill of new love began to fade, replaced by a coldness that he could no longer ignore. Her once warm smile began to feel like a distant memory. Her kindness, once overflowing, became sparse, doled out only when she thought it would serve her. There was a new tone in her voice now, one he couldn't quite place at first, like the warmth had evaporated, leaving behind something far more chilling. Her words, once so tender, now felt sharp and calculated. There were no longer the small moments of affection that had once made him feel cherished. Instead, there was a subtle disdain in her gaze, a look that lingered in the spaces between her words. The playful remarks that had once made him laugh now had a cruel edge to them. "Men your age really should take better care of themselves," she would say, her lips curling into a small smirk like he was some kind of project she needed to fix. The first time she said it, he chuckled awkwardly, trying to brush it off as a joke. But as time went on, those jokes became more frequent and more biting. They weren't jokes anymore. They were criticisms. And every time they landed, they hurt in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He felt as if he were being chipped away, his self-esteem eroding with each passing comment. Yet he convinced himself that it was just part of the dynamic. He tried to laugh it off, to pretend it didn't bother him. He told himself it was just playful teasing, that she didn't mean it, that this was just her way of showing affection. But deep down, the words stung. They stung in ways he didn't want to acknowledge. And as time went on, they only seemed to get worse. "You need to be more like other men," she would say, or maybe if you dressed a little differently, you'd look more appealing. Each remark cut deeper than the last, and he found himself retreating further into himself, retreating from the confident, self-assured man he had once been. He began to doubt himself constantly. The man he saw in the mirror no longer resembled the one he had known all his life. He was aging, yes, but her words made him feel like he was already past his prime, like he wasn't enough for her anymore. He found himself obsessing over his appearance, over every little flaw she might have pointed out. His self-doubt grew like a shadow over his every action, making him second-guess every decision, every choice. But the most painful realization of all came when he saw just how deeply he had become entangled in her world. He wasn't just changing for her anymore. He was losing himself, bit by bit. The man he had been was slipping away, and in his place stood someone unrecognizable, someone desperate to please, to hold on to a love that no longer seemed to hold him. And yet, he couldn't let go. The idea of losing her, of being rejected by her, felt unbearable. He had given so much of himself, adapted so thoroughly, that the very thought of stepping away from her felt like an impossible task. He had become so deeply enmeshed in her vision of who he should be, that he no longer knew how to stand on his own 2 feet. He had tried so hard to become the person she wanted him to be, to meet her ever-changing expectations, that he forgot what it felt like to simply be himself. The person he once was, the man who stood proudly in his skin, who was confident in his own choices, was gone. And in his place stood a man who was afraid to show his true self, afraid that the man he had become wasn't good enough, that he would never be able to measure up to her impossible standards. This wasn't love anymore. This was something far darker, far more insidious. He had become a shell of the man he once was, and yet he couldn't break free from the cycle. Each time he gave in to her demands, each time he bent to her will, he moved further away from himself. And the worst part? He couldn't see how to escape. He couldn't see a way out of this suffocating web he had woven around himself. He was no longer sure who he was without her, and that terrified him more than anything else. The breaking point, when it finally arrived, was not the explosive argument he had feared, but rather the quiet, insidious erosion of something he had always held as sacred, their intimacy. It wasn't just about physical closeness for him. Love, in its truest sense, was a blend of affection, tenderness, and emotional warmth. For him, love was a language that transcended the mere act of being together. It was the gentle touch of understanding, the shared moments of silent connection, and the deep feeling of being seen and appreciated. He had always thought he could offer her these things in abundance. His heart, brimming with devotion, had believed she would recognize the depth of his love, that she would cherish what he gave. But instead, it felt like he had become invisible to her, as if the very essence of who he was had become insignificant, unnoticed. It started innocuously enough, with small comments here and there, critiques veiled in concern, or so he had tried to convince himself. But soon, the criticisms began to dig deeper, invading spaces he had never thought to defend. She began to target the most vulnerable aspects of their connection. Their intimacy, that sacred bond they once shared. He had always believed that the beauty of their love wasn't just in the physical act, but in the emotional symbiosis they nurtured. But she didn't see it that way. She began to accuse him of being slow, of being predictable, of not having the vitality, the energy, the passion of a younger man. It was as if she had no interest in the emotional depth he offered, no regard for the sincerity of his gestures. His mind raced, questioning himself, wondering if what he had always known to be love was now being dismissed, discarded as insufficient. Her words struck deep. Her accusations were like arrows aimed straight at his heart, piercing through his most fragile insecurities. The pain wasn't just in the words themselves, but in the realization that she seemed to have stopped seeing him altogether. Each comment, each criticism, made him feel more and more like an outsider in his relationship. He had always believed that love was about mutual understanding, meeting each other's needs, and finding fulfillment in the spaces between them. But now, it felt like he was being stripped of his dignity, slowly reduced to someone less than what he was. He wasn't the young, energetic lover she might have once imagined, but wasn't there still value in what he could offer? Didn't love to grow and evolve with time, gaining richness and depth as the years passed? Each remark she made was like a shadow, lingering long after she had said it. It haunted him, gnawing at his self-worth until he could barely recognize himself in the mirror. Desperation began to set in. He clung to the hope that perhaps this was just a phase, a test, maybe, of his endurance, of his devotion. Maybe she was simply pushing him, wanting him to fight harder for their love. But as days turned into weeks, he could see that nothing was changing. Her criticisms grew sharper, more cutting. She would comment on his body, on his energy, even on the way he moved. She criticized his touch, once so full of tenderness, now reduced to something inadequate, something laughable in her eyes. It was as though everything he had once believed about himself, everything he thought he could offer, was suddenly worthless. The final blow came one night, after another of her stinging remarks. Desperate to salvage something, anything, he decided to open up in a way he hadn't before. He spoke from his heart, trying to show her that love was not just about the fleeting excitement of youth, but about something far deeper, something only time could nurture. He reminded her of the things that came with age, the wisdom, the gentleness, the tender touch of a man who had learned through years of experience how to truly love. He shared this truth with the raw sincerity of someone who had lived, loved, and weathered life's storms. It wasn't a boast, but a vulnerable plea, an attempt to remind her that love was more than just the thrill of youthful passion. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 2 below to let me know that you are still here with me. But her response was nothing short of devastating. She laughed. Not a soft, understanding laugh, but a mocking, dismissive cackle that turned his words into a cruel joke. It wasn't a laugh of amusement. It was the kind of laughter that stripped away his dignity, that made him feel small, insignificant. Her mockery didn't just wound him. It shredded what little remained of his self-esteem. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as though every part of him she had once cherished was now beneath her, something to be ridiculed, something to be discarded. At that moment, the last threads of his pride and hope began to unravel. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to tell her how much her words had hurt him, but he stayed silent. There was nothing more to say. She had made it clear that she no longer saw him the way she once had. His vulnerability had been turned into a weakness. His love had become something pitiful. It was a gut-wrenching realization that maybe he had been fooling himself all along, that maybe, just maybe, their love had never been what he thought it was. Yet, despite the pain, he clung to the belief that this was just a passing phase. Perhaps it was a test, a way to see if he would fight for their relationship, if he would rise above her criticisms and prove his love through patience and persistence. For a time, he held on to that hope, convincing himself that his enduring commitment would eventually win her over. He thought that if he could just be patient enough, if he could prove his devotion, she would see the depth of his feelings. But the days turned into weeks, then months, and with each passing day, the weight of her words grew heavier, sinking him deeper into a place of despair. His confidence, once steady and strong, was now barely a shadow of what it had been. He began to question everything he had once believed about love. Was he just an aging man, desperately clinging to a dream of youth and vitality that had long passed? Was he nothing more than a relic, someone who had outlived his purpose in her life? She made him feel invisible, like he was fading away, like a man whose prime had come and gone, leaving him with nothing more than a collection of memories and regrets. The worst part was the quiet resignation that followed, the slow, aching realization that he might never be enough for her, that his love might never be enough for anyone. It was as if he had become a ghost in his own life, no longer someone who mattered, no longer someone worth loving. And yet, he could not let go. Despite everything, despite the ridicule, the hurt, and the constant barrage of doubts, there was still a flicker of hope in his heart. A part of him believed that love could still triumph over time, over criticism, over the fading energy of age. But the more he tried, the more he seemed to fade into the background of her life until he was no longer even a presence. To an outsider, His decision to remain in the relationship might seem utterly incomprehensible, even pitiable. It was easy for his friends and family, from a distance, to question why he would continue to endure such suffering, why he allowed himself to be so utterly diminished by someone who, from all appearances, considered him disposable. They could not understand how a man with so much to offer, someone who had lived through so many challenges and had gained so much wisdom, could subject himself to such endless emotional turmoil. They saw the toll it was taking on him, the sleepless nights, the hollowed-out look in his eyes, the way he seemed to shrink a little more each time she spoke to him with disdain or indifference. They would ask him, with genuine concern, why he didn't just walk away, why he didn't free himself from the clutches of a relationship that had soured, that had long since stopped nourishing his soul. But, despite their pleas, he stayed, because for him, leaving wasn't just about walking away from a relationship. It was about leaving behind everything he had believed in, everything that had once made him feel whole. For those who have loved deeply, especially those who have loved with all their heart, to the point of exhaustion and self-sacrifice, there is an almost unexplainable force that keeps them tethered to that love, even when it brings them nothing but pain. There is a strange, binding power in love that hurts, a power that can make even the most rational person lose sight of themselves. Love, when it grows too deeply rooted, becomes something akin to an addiction, something that invades every corner of the mind and soul, so that the idea of leaving feels impossible. For him, leaving was simply inconceivable, because love had sunk its roots so deeply into the core of his being. It wasn't just about her. It was about the version of her he had fallen in love with all those years ago. It was about the woman who had once been so full of life, whose laughter had been like music in his ears. It was about the woman who had made him feel young again, whose warmth had made him feel seen and understood in a world that often felt cold and indifferent. In those early days, when their love was new and fresh, he had felt like the world was full of possibilities. He had felt alive, full of hope, as though anything was possible. Those moments, though brief and fleeting, were unforgettable, etched into his memory like a photograph that could never fade. But as time wore on, that woman, the one who had filled him with such light and joy, began to slip away, replaced by someone who seemed distant, indifferent, even cruel. Yet, despite everything, he stayed. Why? Because deep inside, he still clung to the belief that the woman he once knew was still there somewhere, hiding beneath the layers of bitterness and coldness. He stayed because love, that deep, overwhelming love, was like an anchor, holding him fast even when he could see that the storm was far from over. But somewhere, buried beneath the pain and confusion, he began to sense that something had shifted. He wasn't sure when it happened, or how, but over time, the love he had for her began to feel different. It was no longer the passionate, consuming love he had once felt. No, now it was something far more complicated, a tangled mess of need, desperation, and fear. He was no longer in love with the woman she was. He was in love with the idea of her, the person she used to be. And that love had become a cruel illusion. He was trapped in a cycle of longing for someone who no longer existed, and in doing so, he had lost himself. The man who had once been so full of confidence and strength had gradually been chipped away, piece by piece, until he was nothing more than a shadow of the person he used to be. He realized, with growing clarity, that he had been clinging not to her, but to an illusion of what she could be, to an image of love that no longer had any bearing on reality. He wasn't bound to her youth, her beauty, or the life they had once shared. No, he was bound to something much darker, a desperate need to prove his worth to someone who could never see him for who he truly was. He was lost in the pursuit of someone else's approval, chasing after a mirage that would always slip further away. The harder he tried, the more he seemed to lose himself, until one day, it dawned on him that he was no longer living for himself. He was living to earn her affection, her validation, and no matter what he did, he could never be enough. Then, one night, after another painful argument, one where her words cut him down to size and left him feeling smaller than ever, something in him broke. The conversation had ended with her dismissing him, as usual, with the same cold indifference that had become their norm. He sat there, alone in the dark, his heart heavy with a mixture of sorrow and frustration. And for the first time in what felt like years, he looked at himself in the mirror, not just to see his face, but to truly see himself. What he saw there shocked him. The man who stared back at him wasn't the youthful, hopeful man who had fallen in love with her all those years ago. No, he was a man who had been through decades of life, who had lived, loved, and lost. His face was weathered by time, his skin marked by the lines of age, but his eyes, those eyes, still held something. They held strength. They held resilience. They held the weight of both the joy and the sorrow he had experienced. He was not just a man worn down by time. He was a man who had survived. He had endured. And in that moment, something clicked inside him. He realized that he had spent so many years trying to prove himself to her, trying to make her love him, that he had forgotten one very important thing. He needed to love himself first. He needed to reclaim the man he had once been, the man who had pride, who had dignity, and who deserved to be loved, not just by others, but by himself. With newfound courage, he knew what he had to do. The next day, he sat across from her, his heart pounding with nervous energy, but his resolve unwavering. This time, he wasn't just speaking out of hurt. He was speaking out of strength. He looked her in the eyes and told her, calmly but firmly, that while he would always love her, he could no longer bear the pain of the way she treated him. He could no longer endure the subtle humiliation, the hurtful words, and the constant feeling of being less than he was. He told her, with a clarity he hadn't felt in years, that he was ready to walk away. He was choosing himself over a love that had become a source of suffering, and he was no longer willing to lose himself in the process. Her face registered shock. She had never expected him to finally take such a stand. For years, she had assumed he would always be there, always willing to endure whatever pain she dished out. But now, as he sat there, with dignity restored in his eyes, he felt something he hadn't felt in so long, his power. He felt the stirrings of his dignity, the dignity that had been slowly worn down by years of being belittled and disregarded. He had decided to walk away, not just from her, but from the version of himself he had become in her shadow. And in that moment, he knew that no matter how much it hurt, he had made the right choice. He was no longer a man defined by someone else's love. He was a man who had rediscovered the power of loving himself. It was a conversation that cut deeper than anything he had experienced in years. The words spoken between them were sharp, heavy with years of unspoken tension, yet in their pain, they offered a strange kind of release. There was something about the finality of it, something liberating about facing the truth head-on. For the very first time, he felt that he was truly acting his age. Not in the way most people would expect, not in the sense of growing old and giving in to weakness, but rather embracing the fullness of his years. It wasn't about surrendering to the passage of time, but about stepping into the wisdom, strength, and resilience that only age can provide. In that moment, he realized that maturity didn't just come with the physical signs of aging, it came with a deeper understanding of who he was, and who he no longer needed to be. As he walked away from her home, something within him shifted. A heavy, suffocating weight he hadn't even realized he was carrying seemed to lift in an instant. It was as if a burden he had been shouldering for far too long, without even knowing it, had been suddenly removed. The sense of relief that washed over him was overwhelming, and it wasn't just the emotional weight he had shed, but the mental and psychological shackles that had kept him bound to a version of himself that no longer served him. At that moment, there was a quiet but powerful recognition. He had been holding onto a lie he had told himself, or perhaps one he had allowed others to tell him. The lie that he was somehow less because of his age, or because of his inability to meet someone else's expectations. He paused for a moment as he stood outside, the cool breeze brushing against his face. His mind began to wander through the years, through all the experiences that had molded him, through the pain he had endured, the battles he had fought, and the moments of triumph that had sometimes been so fleeting that he hadn't allowed himself to fully appreciate them. All those memories, those victories and losses, had led him to this place. And as he stood there, breathing in the stillness of the evening air, he finally recognized the most profound truth. He was valuable. The realization hit him like a wave. His worth was not tied to the approval of anyone, not tied to what others thought of him or how they perceived his aging process. No, his value was inherent. It was shaped by the stories he carried, the wisdom he had gained, and the love he had given, and it did not diminish with time. The wrinkles on his face, the gray in his hair, the small aches and pains that came with age, they weren't signs of decline. They were emblems of the life he had lived, the lessons he had learned, the battles he had fought, and the resilience he had developed. He was not fading. He was evolving. But perhaps the most liberating realization of all was this: not everyone could see that value. Not everyone was capable of recognizing what was truly important. Some were too fixated on the surface, on the outward appearance, on the fleeting markers of youth and beauty. They couldn't see the depth, the strength, the wisdom that came with a life well lived. And for so long, he had allowed himself to be defined by those shallow judgments. He had bent to the whims of someone who saw only what she wanted to see, not the whole person in front of her. By trying so hard to meet her needs, to fit her vision of what he should be, he had lost touch with himself. He had surrendered pieces of his identity, pieces of his soul, in an attempt to appease her. But in walking away, he had done something monumental. He had reclaimed himself. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 3 below to let me know that you are still here with me. He didn't just walk away from the relationship. He walked away from the expectations that had been placed on him, expectations that had nothing to do with his true self. He walked away from the false narrative he had allowed to unfold in his life. And in doing so, he found something far more precious than any approval, any affirmation from another person. He found his pride. Not the kind of pride that is built on arrogance or ego, but the quiet, steady pride that comes from knowing who you are, from understanding your worth and standing firm in it. With that pride came something even more profound: peace. A peace that settled deep within him, like a long-lost friend he had been waiting for without even knowing it. The kind of peace that comes from finally accepting yourself, from realizing that you are enough, just as you are. In the days that followed, the silence was both his enemy and his ally. At first, the solitude was a reminder of what he had lost, of the life he had left behind. The house felt quieter now, and the empty spaces where her presence used to fill him with warmth were now cold and hollow. But slowly, gradually, he began to notice something else. The silence was not an enemy at all. It was a gift. It was a space where he could reconnect with himself, where he could reflect on who he was without the constant pressure of another's expectations. He began to find comfort in his own company, in the peaceful solitude that allowed him to truly listen to his thoughts, his desires, and his own heart. And as the days stretched on, the loneliness became less painful. It was no longer a reminder of something missing. It became a space of clarity, a canvas on which he could rediscover who he was. The quiet became sacred. He realized that even without her, even without anyone else, he was still whole. His identity, his worth, was not something that depended on the presence of another person. He was a man with a rich history, with experiences that had shaped him, and with a value that could not be diminished by time or the judgments of others. The lesson he learned was simple, but it would stay with him for the rest of his life. Self-worth is not something to be bargained with. It should never be sacrificed for someone else's approval. Love that diminishes you, that makes you feel less than, is not love at all. It is a distortion of what love is meant to be. True love is built on respect, equality, and the recognition that both partners are whole and valuable. It is only when two people meet as equals, each with their sense of worth, that a deep, lasting love can grow. And perhaps most importantly, it is only when you learn to love and respect yourself that you can truly offer love to another in a healthy, balanced way. Ultimately, The journey to happiness and fulfillment is not about seeking validation from others. It is about knowing your worth, accepting it, and standing firm in it. It is through self-love and self-respect that we find the peace and happiness we so desperately seek. When we let go of toxic relationships, toxic beliefs, and toxic attachments, we make room for the love that is truly meant for us. Love that respects us, nurtures us, and helps us grow. And when we learn to love ourselves fully, we open the door to happiness that no one can take away. As we wrap up today's video, I want you to take a moment and reflect on everything we've discussed. What have you learned about self-worth, love, and the importance of embracing your values? It's not easy to let go of old patterns, but as we've seen, true freedom comes when we finally learn to love ourselves enough to walk away from what no longer serves us. So, I want to hear from you. What is one thing you've learned from this video that you're going to bring into your life? Maybe it's recognizing your worth, letting go of toxic relationships, or simply giving yourself the love and respect you deserve. Whatever it is, share it with us in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave your thoughts and comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you never miss more inspiring content like this. Thanks for watching, and remember, your value is already within you. Keep embracing your true self.